By 1786, the French crown was collapsing under 2 billion livres of borrowing, and the glittering court of Versailles existed on borrowed time. The man who had to face this debt was Louis XVI, a king whose simple weakness for popularity was about to cost him everything. This is the story of how a financial crisis turned a royal locksmith into the unwilling victim of the most violent political idea in history. The French Revolution is, perhaps, the central political event of modern history. Other revolutions reshape nations, but the French believed they could reboot society itself, wiping the slate clean to create something entirely new. The fallout of this single, violent drama would export the ideas of the nation and modern nationalism across Europe and the world. It is the revolution that gave us the political concepts of left and right, ideas that dominate public life today. He was not a monster. Louis XVI was mild, affable, and by all accounts, a reasonably likable man. He preferred tinkering with locks in his workshop and going hunting to the crushing burden of statecraft. You look at Louis XVI, and you do not see a man whom millions would want to see dragged to the scaffold. Yet the kingdom he inherited was the biggest in continental Europe, with a population of 28 million people, and the world's second largest economic power, rivaled only by Great Britain. It was the only European country that had both a serious navy and a serious army. Its capital, Paris, the second biggest city on the continent after London. But the vast kingdom was deeply fragmented. 8 out of 10 French people worked the land. They were peasants, much more agricultural than their British rivals, and regionally distinct. The French the king spoke would have been unintelligible to most of his subjects, who spoke Flemish, Breton, or German dialects. Louis had been brought up to believe he held the greatest and most absolute power over men, received from God himself. Yet this power was tightly circumscribed. He relied on a massive hierarchy of nobles, judges, and officials. His kingdom was not a machine to be fixed. It was a massive, multi-layered patchwork of convention and customs, so complicated that commissioned scholars eventually threw up their hands and declared it impossible to even write down. This unwieldy structure faced 3 converging storms. First, hunger. Freak weather, including massive hailstorms and brutal cold, had decimated the wheat harvests of 1787 and 1788. This was the contingency that historians often overlook. Bread prices had soared to heights not seen in decades. The peasants, who spent up to 80% of their income just on bread, were starving. This mass hunger guaranteed that the inevitable financial crisis would swell the crowds in the cities with desperate, angry people. The rural landscape was a tinderbox, and the smallest spark of defiance could ignite a province. Second, virtue. The Enlightenment had armed these people with the belief they could restart the world. But the third storm, the immediate threat, was the financial time bomb left by previous generations. Louis XVI's fatal weakness was exposed the moment he had to choose between his principles and his popularity. This unwieldy structure existed during an age of unprecedented excitement and dynamism. The France of the late 18th century was the home of chemistry, where industry and trade boomed. It was the age of invention, where the spectacle of hot air ballooning, the first flight was from the Bois de Boulogne in 1783, captured the public imagination, creating the sense that genius was everywhere, conquering nature and the elements. This was the Enlightenment, an era that promised that problems could be solved and the world could be rationally ordered. But the Enlightenment was a double-edged sword. While Louis was a man of reason who respected the rights of his citizens, even writing in his exercise book that the fundamental rights were life, honor, liberty, and property, a new, younger generation was emerging. They were more romantic, loving the intense feeling and emotional purity championed by writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They distrusted the older, skeptical generation. The old Enlightenment valued witty irony and the poking of fun. The new generation, often inspired by American republicanism, valued authentic feeling. For them, truth did not lie in skeptical, witty irony, but in intense feeling, tenderness, and family. Tears, crying, became a sign of authenticity. The entire political landscape was being split between the age of reason, which sought to calculate and reform, and the emerging age of sensibility, which sought emotional purity and moral revolution. This generational and philosophical clash fractured the very elite trying to guide the country. And underpinning all of this was the concept of virtue. Virtue was the non-negotiable abstract noun of the age. If you were decent, you were in favor of it. If you mocked it, you were not just old-fashioned, you were deemed evil. This pursuit of absolute virtue fueled a new, highly politicized and passionate culture, especially in Paris. Pamphlets were read aloud on street corners, and coffee houses buzzed with political talk. A new term, public opinion, emerged in the 1750s because the thing itself was starting to exist in a way it never had before. This intense emotionality, this obsession with purity, combined with economic collapse, would soon become the most terrifying force in Europe. Louis XVI's regime might be remembered today as corrupt and cruel, but in reality, it was a state that was changing, modernizing, and dynamic. Yet its structural flaws were fatal. The monarchy suffered massive money problems because it was trying to fund a new age, a military revolution with larger armies and navies operating on a global scale, with an antiquated system. The French crown had been running up massive debt since the 1720s. By the 1770s, France was 2 billion livres in debt, and 60% of the entire budget went to servicing that debt, just the interest payments. The issue was not the scale of the debt, which was actually 3 times greater in Great Britain. The issue was that Great Britain could always raise new taxes through the House of Commons. France could not. It had no national bank and no regular elected assembly. The memory of the disastrous Mississippi bubble crash, orchestrated by the Scottish financier John Law decades earlier, had left the French elite permanently distrustful of financial institutions and paper money, guaranteeing they remained shackled to the past. The only precedent for a national assembly was the Estates General, which had last met in 1614, and nobody could even remember how it was organized or who voted for it. The French system raised tax through a patchwork of strange, outdated measures, including an expensive tax on salt that spurred massive smuggling, and internal customs duties that forced millers to pay multiple times just to get their grain from Provence to Paris. This web of local tariffs and internal customs, a bureaucratic nightmare, choked the internal economy and hampered the very commerce Louis should have been promoting. The kind of thing that a man like Louis XVI, who loved efficiency, would want to fix. But Louis had a problem. Whenever he came up against opposition, he always backed down. Early in his reign, a liberal reformer named Turgot had tried to deregulate the economy by liberalizing grain prices, a key step toward a free market. When bread prices soared and looting followed, the infamous Flour War, Louis got rid of him, unwilling to be unpopular. He wanted to be loved, and that is not an ideal quality for a king in a time of tremendous change. For those interested in how these incredible cultural shifts and political meltdowns shape our world. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss any of our upcoming historical deep dives. Louis avoided a riot by sacking Turgot, but the decision to seek popularity rather than solvency only guaranteed that the next crisis would be far too big to avoid, and that next crisis was already sailing across the Atlantic. In the next few years, the problem became terminal. Louis decided to support the American colonists against the British. The finance minister, a Swiss banker named Jacques Necker, organized short-term loans to pay for it. The war was expensive, particularly the top-notch navy France had to maintain. France ran up 1.5 billion livres in new debt. This money was raised through high-interest, short-term borrowing, a ruinous tactic known as financial warfare. It was a massive gamble. If they could seize the rich Caribbean islands, the profit would cover the cost. They managed to inflict a defeat on Britain, but they didn't capture the islands that were the main priority. France was left with colossal debts and nothing to show for it. Without much exaggeration, the cost of the American war brought on the terminal crisis of the French monarchy. The financial crisis was only made worse by the core injustice of the system, the hierarchy of privileges. If you were a nobleman or a clergyman, you did not pay tax. People saw this not as a disgraceful exemption, but as the essence of their ancestral rights. To demand a uniform tax, like a machine, was seen as despotic. Liberty, they believed, lay in the ancient quirks, traditions, and differences. The defenders of these traditions were the parlements, the high courts, particularly the Parlement of Paris. They were the aristocracy's blunt instrument, using the sacred language of liberty to teach the commoners exactly how to defy the crown. When the king introduced an edict, the Parlement had to register it, affirming that it did not contravene the rights of the French people. Since the 1750s, they had bitterly resisted new taxes, increasingly posing as the defenders of the nation against the suffocating absolutism of the Versailles court. The physical distance between Louis at Versailles and the Parlement in Paris only enhanced the resentment, creating the image of an out-of-touch, corrupt court sealed off from a seething, politically excited capital. By 1786, the new finance minister, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, a wealthy, urbane stock market player who everyone loved to hate, was faced with an abyss. He went to Louis and dropped the bombshell. The annual deficit was 80 million livres, and Necker's short-term war loans were about to fall due. Calonne declared total reform was necessary. They couldn't rely on new loans to pay the old ones. Calonne's plan was radical: abolish all tax privileges and introduce a single land tax, regardless of social status. To get this done, he knew he had to bypass the Parlement. He convinced the king to call an extraordinary meeting, an assembly of notables, princes, archbishops, and dukes. Calonne believed that if the greatest men in the kingdom agreed, the Parlement could be ignored. Calonne was asking the turkeys to vote for Christmas. The notables hated his plan. They did not like paying the land tax, and they especially did not like sitting with the commoners in local assemblies. Calonne had misjudged them. They would only trade their privileges for a massive increase in political power. They played the only game they knew to kick the tax increases down the road. They said only the Estates General, that ancient, forgotten owl, could approve new taxes. Furious, Calonne did something disastrous. He went public, seeking to rouse the people against the privileged. He sent a pamphlet to every priest in Paris, had it read in gazettes, and on street corners, declaring that France was at a crossroads and needed total change. He used the terms that would define the revolution: national will, patriotism, and declaring that the privileged would be sacrificed when justice required it. The king sacked Calonne, but the revolution had found its vocabulary. With the coffers empty and the public now politically aroused, Louis turned to a man with a face full of scabs and a ledger full of lies: Archbishop Brienne. The irony was that most people, when given the chance to speak, sided with the notables, these privileged men who did not want to pay tax. They were so terrified of an autocratic monarchy that they saw the nobles, for the moment, as well-informed patriots who knew the true interests of the nation. They were riding a crocodile. Louis had to find a new finance minister. He chose the Archbishop of Toulouse, Étienne Charles de Lomenie de Brienne, a noted opponent of Calonne, who had a face famously covered in peeling scabs and tissue. Brienne, who had previously claimed the deficit was bunk, looked at the books and announced the truth. The deficit was not 80 million livres, but 140 million. Brienne quickly went back to his old chums in the notables and asked for new taxes. They said no, forcing him to scrap the assembly. Louis became desperately depressed. Accounts describe him growing increasingly fat, trying to escape the insoluble problem by hunting. Brienne and the king faced a terrible choice: call the Estates General and risk the total overthrow of the state, or try to bully the Parlement into submission. They chose the latter, going back to the Parlement of Paris in the summer of 1787. The Parlement of Paris said no way. They rejected the taxes in groundbreaking language, declaring that the days when kings simply asked for taxes are gone. Absolutism, they said, was over, and the king must be governed by the law. Crucially, they used a new word to describe their fellow Frenchmen. They were not subjects, but citizens. All this magnificent language was first being used to defend the tax privileges of the nobility and the clergy, a monumental irony. Brienne was outraged. He exiled the Parlement to Troyes and had their chambers sealed off by the Swiss Guard. The reaction in Paris was total bedlam. The city erupted in rioting. People who gave out royal edicts were attacked. A suspected police agent was beaten to death. The government sent in infantry units and shut down clubs and societies to stop the spread of subversive ideas. The capital had become a powder keg, but the most important event in the entire crisis did not happen in Paris. It happened far away, in a provincial city in the foothills of the Alps, Grenoble. It was Saturday, the 7th of June, 1788. Brienne's decree, attempting to strip the local courts of their power, was read out in the marketplace of Grenoble. The city was a regional capital and a glove-making center, full of lawyers and clerks who owed their livelihoods to the court. The glove-making business was in crisis, and the city was seething with anger. When the king's troops came to remove the parliament leaders, a riot began. It quickly escalated from a protest to a general strike. The city gates were closed. Authorities sent in soldiers, but they were not enough. People went up to the roofs of their houses, grabbed the heavy tiles, and began bombarding the soldiers below. This was the moment that became known as the Day of the Tiles. The soldiers lost their composure and began shooting, killing a 12-year-old boy and a hatter. The crowd went ballistic, parading the bloodied clothes around, ringing the church bells to summon peasants from the surrounding countryside. The mob seized the city, even ransacking the governor's natural history cabinet. A piece of natural history, a stuffed eagle, was lost to the rage of the crowd. The most critical moment was that the elite fight. The quarrel between the king and the notables had been overtaken by a mass uprising. The Parlement judges were carried aloft by the crowd, but they were not leaders. They were trophies, or perhaps prisoners of the chaos. One young man, however, saw the collapse of royal authority not as a threat, but as a chance to seize control. Jean-Joseph Mounier, a 29-year-old ambitious local lawyer who just bought his way into the lowest rank of the nobility, is arguably the first true French revolutionary leader. Just a few weeks later, Mounier convened a huge meeting outside Grenoble at the Château de Vizille. He declared his platform, free elections, and when the Estates General meets, the Third Estate, the commoners, must have the same number of representatives as the other two estates, the lords and the clergy, combined. Furthermore, they must all sit in one chamber so that the commoners could dominate. This was a direct call for majority rule. The general will would dominate over the ancient privileges of the old order. Many historians say this moment was so groundbreaking, so seismic, that it was the true kickoff point for the revolution. The language used was passionate and stark, talk of patriotic fire and sacrifices. This new movement was built on a simple, terrifying dichotomy. They were the patriots, and their opponents were traitors to the nation who should be treated accordingly. This was an incipiently totalitarian quality. If you are the embodiment of the nation, then your enemies by definition must be traitors. The passion, the idea of virtue, and this simple radicalized view of politics fused together, giving them the confidence to declare, who cares about the past? We can draw up a new constitution based on the essential rights of man. This was fundamentally different from the American constitution makers, who were trapped in the British mindset of balancing power to guard against mob democracy. The French revolutionaries had no time for such nuance. As one friend of Rousseau declared, the people are the state itself. By the immutable laws of nature, the people are everything. Meanwhile, Archbishop Brienne, with his skin complaint, was thinking what on earth to do. His plan had not worked. His options were exhausted. He went to Louis and said, "Archbishop, you must think we are lost." The king replied, "They might overturn the state and the monarchy." Brienne said, "I'm afraid we have no choice at all." In the second week of August, 1788, they went public. The king would summon the Estates General. They didn't know how it would be elected or how it would work, but they would call it all the same. Against this desperate political background, the final blow fell. On the 16th of August, Brienne announced they had run out of money. The royal treasury was virtually empty. From now on, people would be paid in IOUs, in paper money the public had no reason to believe in. France was officially bankrupt. This final financial collapse, the ultimate surrender to debt, was the force that made the political disaster inevitable. Louis XVI had been forced to summon the very body he feared would overturn his state and his monarchy. The king had surrendered. The nation's finances were shattered, but the final bloody act was yet to begin. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the collapse of the Ancien Régime, please comment below with the historical figure you think was most responsible for lighting the fire of revolution. And don't forget to share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. For more stories about the critical moments that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel.